In a world of glittering skyscrapers, lavish parties, and endless indulgences, Daniel stood alone, surrounded by people but utterly isolated. The thumping bass of high society gatherings, the hum of conversations thick with pleasantries and flattery, and the gleaming smiles thrown his way, all of it had become a cage, trapping him in a cycle of superficiality. Despite being one of the wealthiest men in the city, Daniel felt the crushing weight of loneliness as he moved through rooms filled with people who adored his wealth, yet saw nothing of the man beneath it. To them, he was a symbol of success, an embodiment of power and luxury. But to himself, he felt like a hollow statue. Over time, he'd realized that the more his bank account grew, the fewer genuine connections he had. For years, he'd tried to ignore it. Instead of confronting this emptiness, he threw himself further into his work, obsessively chasing after accolades, investments, and properties that would boost his standing. He expanded his fleet of luxury cars, his collection of penthouses, his art pieces. He spent lavishly on weekend getaways to hidden beaches, hosted exclusive events with the world's elite, and secured every material possession anyone could ever dream of. And yet, as his list of achievements grew longer, his life grew colder. Every night, after the final guest left and the lights dimmed, he lay alone in his sprawling penthouse, high above the city, watching the glowing lights below and feeling an ache gnawing at him. A dull, unending emptiness he could not shake. No amount of wealth or influence seemed capable of filling the void in his heart. Daniel could feel himself drifting further from any semblance of true connection. His life had become a meticulously constructed image of success, a picture of a man who had it all. But this life, he was beginning to realize, was nothing more than a gilded cage, and he, its prisoner. Every opulent purchase, every grand achievement, every carefully curated social engagement was only deepening his sense of isolation. Wealth and power, he was beginning to understand, could be a double-edged sword. They brought with them comfort and luxury, but without love, without loyalty, without kindness, they were hollow victories. His fortune drew people to him like moths to a flame, yet the ease with which they flocked to him only intensified his suspicion of their motives. People who once saw him as an equal now approached him with caution, their intentions clouded by greed. Friends from his youth, people he once laughed with and shared stories with, looked at him differently now, their eyes reflecting envy, their voices carrying a slight edge of tension as they realized his power. He saw in them a desire to somehow benefit from his success. Each interaction seemed tainted by what he could offer rather than who he was. Every day, he felt more detached from the world around him, more aware that he was admired for his wealth and resented for it in equal measure. This realization weighed heavily on him, filling him with a growing desire to find someone who could see past his wealth, someone who could love him for the person he was beneath the luxury, the titles, and the achievements. The thought consumed him, pushing him toward a decision that would change his life forever. Daniel knew he had to take drastic measures if he was to uncover the truth about the people around him. He craved authenticity, a connection untouched by ambition, greed, or desire for power. He wanted a love that was real, that would see him as just a man, not a billionaire, not an icon of success. After countless sleepless nights, he realized there was only one way to find it. Frustrated with the hollow relationships and superficial interactions that surrounded him, Daniel devised a bold plan. He would temporarily abandon his wealth, discarding every ounce of his carefully crafted image. In its place, he would take on the guise of a poor, injured traveler, someone with nothing to offer but himself. He hoped that by shedding his status and the trappings of his success, he might be able to meet someone who saw beyond appearances, someone who would accept him in his most vulnerable state. It was a daring move and a risky one. When he shared his idea with his family, they were initially shocked and alarmed. His mother, who had always been protective of him, worried endlessly about his safety, fearing the dangers he might face without the protection of his wealth and status. His father, on the other hand, was baffled by the idea, seeing it as a threat to their family's reputation and legacy. To him, Daniel's plan was reckless, a misguided escapade that risked everything they'd built. But Daniel was resolute. He reassured his family, promising to be careful, to keep his identity hidden. He convinced them that this was something he had to do, that he needed to find a connection rooted in something other than wealth. After much hesitation, his parents reluctantly agreed. With a heavy heart, they watched him leave, knowing there was no turning back. Dressed in tattered clothes, Daniel set out on his journey, leaving behind the city and all that he knew. With his once powerful stride now replaced by a limp, he hobbled through quiet towns and dusty roads, blending into the shadows. He felt a strange mixture of freedom and vulnerability as he shed his former self, becoming just another face in a world that had no reason to notice him. The further he traveled, the more he let go of the persona he had cultivated over the years. Here, he was not a billionaire but an ordinary man with a worn cane, a slouched posture, and a small, frayed bag slung over his shoulder. One misty morning, as Daniel sat by a fountain in a small village, he noticed a young woman walking toward him. Her clothes were simple, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, and her eyes were warm and gentle. She was not dressed in expensive fabrics, nor did she carry herself with the haughtiness he'd grown accustomed to in his circle. Her name, he would soon learn, was Grace. She approached him with a kindness that felt almost foreign to him, offering him a loaf of bread without a hint of judgment or curiosity about his background. As they spoke, Daniel found himself drawn to her sincerity. Grace listened with genuine interest, asking him about his journey and how he had ended up in her village. He shared a version of his story, careful to leave out his true identity, painting himself as a traveler who had fallen on hard times. Grace did not pry, nor did she seem suspicious. She simply invited him to her home, where she lived with her grandmother Clara, and offered him a place to sleep, food, and warmth. It was an act of compassion he had not experienced in years, and it touched him deeply. In the days that followed, Daniel settled into their modest home, growing accustomed to the simple rhythms of village life. He marveled at the contrast between his new surroundings and the life he had left behind. Here, there were no lavish parties, no gleaming skyscrapers, no walls adorned with priceless art. Instead, there was laughter, kindness, and a sense of community he had nearly forgotten existed. Clara, with her wise eyes and gentle spirit, reminded him of his own grandmother, who had passed away long ago. She treated him like family from the moment he entered her home, her warmth and kindness a balm to his weary soul. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, Daniel felt a growing unease. He had come to care for Grace and Clara, to feel a sense of belonging he had never felt before. But he was living a lie, deceiving them with his disguise, hiding the truth of who he was. The weight of this deception became heavier with each passing day, filling him with guilt every time he sat down at their table, every time he shared a laugh with them. He found himself questioning whether he had the right to be there, whether he deserved the kindness they offered so freely. The more he grew to care for Grace, the stronger his guilt became. He knew that revealing his true identity would shatter the trust they had built, but he also knew that continuing this lie would only deepen the betrayal. He felt trapped, torn between his desire to be honest and his fear of losing the only connection that had ever felt real. Tensions began to rise as others in the village took notice of his presence. Grace had long been pursued by Oliver, the son of a wealthy landowner, who was both frustrated and puzzled by her interest in Daniel. Oliver couldn't understand why Grace would favor a poor stranger over him, and his jealousy quickly turned to hostility. Grace's friend Emily also disapproved, urging her to seek stability and comfort rather than risking hardship with someone who had nothing. The pressure grew, and Daniel knew he couldn't continue the charade. One evening, unable to bear the weight of his deception, he sat down with Grace and Clara and told them the truth. He revealed his true identity, explaining why he had come to the village and the desperation that had driven him to take on a false persona. He spoke of his longing for a connection built on authenticity, his desire to escape the emptiness of his life in the city. Grace and Clara listened in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of shock, hurt, and disbelief. They had welcomed him into their lives, shown him kindness and trust, and he had repaid them with lies. As Grace quietly asked him to leave, her voice laced with sadness and disappointment, Daniel felt the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. Returning to the city with a heavy heart, Daniel faced his family's reactions. His mother offered sympathy, sensing the pain and regret in his eyes. His father, however, dismissed the entire experience as foolish, a blemish on their family's reputation. He urged Daniel to forget the village, to marry someone of status, and to move on. But Daniel could not move on. His experience in the village had changed him, and he was determined to find a way back to Grace, to make amends and rekindle the trust he had broken. Back in the city, Daniel felt like a stranger in his own life. His penthouse, once a fortress of comfort and indulgence, now felt like a hollow echo of who he used to be. Every surface gleamed with polish, every inch of the space exuding luxury, yet it all seemed empty. The expansive windows that stretched from floor to ceiling offered a breathtaking view of the city's glittering skyline, but to Daniel, it was only a reminder of the vast emptiness he felt inside. The opulence that had once filled him with pride now felt like heavy chains, pulling him further from what truly mattered. The once pleasurable routines of his old life now felt meaningless. The lavish parties, the extravagant dinners, and the stream of flattery from people he barely knew. All of it left him cold. He would sit in silence, a glass of untouched wine in hand, staring out over the city lights, feeling a pang of loss he couldn't shake. Memories of Grace's laughter would come to him unexpectedly, filling the silence with a sweetness that made him ache. He would hear Clara's gentle voice in his mind, her words filled with a wisdom he had never encountered in his city life. He would think of their modest home, filled not with things but with warmth, kindness, and an open-heartedness that felt rare and precious. It dawned on him that his heart had found a true home in the simplicity of Grace and Clara's lives, a life far removed from the wealth and status that had once defined him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something irreplaceable. He had hurt them, deceived them, and in doing so, had almost destroyed the very connection he had come to cherish. His need to return to them became undeniable. He had to explain himself, to seek their forgiveness, and to try to repair the damage he had done. The life he once valued now meant little if it couldn't be shared with them, if it couldn't be infused with the warmth he had found in their world. He was willing to give up everything he had, even his family's approval, to be close to them again. When he told his family of his intention to return to Grace, his mother immediately sensed the resolve in his voice, a determination she had never quite seen in him before. She had always been the softer voice in his life, and while she worried about his well-being, she recognized that this was something her son needed to do for himself. His father, however, reacted with fury. To him, Daniel's affection for a village girl, a simple woman who lived without any power, wealth, or influence, was a disgrace, an embarrassment that could tarnish their family's reputation. He demanded that Daniel abandon his foolishness and instead marry someone of wealth and status, someone who could secure valuable business alliances and reinforce the family's empire. But Daniel had changed, and the man who once craved his father's approval now felt liberated from it. For the first time, Daniel looked his father in the eyes, calm but resolute, and refused his demands. He made it clear that he would not allow his life to be dictated by expectations he no longer believed in. This decision was his, and he was ready to accept any consequence that came with it. His father, enraged, issued an ultimatum, vowing to disown Daniel if he followed through with his plan. But Daniel simply nodded, unshaken, knowing that his heart had already made its choice. With a renewed sense of purpose, Daniel returned to the village. As he walked along the familiar dusty roads, a flood of emotions washed over him. The sound of distant laughter, the smell of wood fires, the sight of children playing. All of it felt like pieces of a life he was meant to be a part of. He knew, however, that this homecoming would not be easy. He had left Grace and Clara with broken trust, and he could not assume that forgiveness would come quickly. When he finally reached their home, Grace greeted him with a guarded expression, the warmth in her eyes tempered by hurt. She listened as he spoke, his words a mixture of apology and hope, but her face remained distant, uncertain. Just as he felt the ache of losing her, Clara stepped forward, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "Sometimes," she said, People need second chances to show who they really are. Her words offered him a sliver of hope, a door slightly ajar. Moved by her compassion, Daniel knew he would need to prove himself, to show them through his actions that he was worthy of their trust. Daniel poured himself into their lives, doing everything he could to support Grace and Clara. He helped in the fields, repaired their home, and spent countless hours simply being present, listening to them, understanding their struggles and joys. He did not ask for forgiveness outright, but instead dedicated himself to earning it, showing them through his actions that he was there to stay, not as a visitor, but as someone who wanted to belong. Slowly, he began to feel the walls between them soften, the trust beginning to take root again. But beneath the surface, a dark shadow was brewing. Unknown to Grace and Clara, Daniel's father, determined to sever their connection, had taken matters into his own hands. He sent men to the village, intimidating Grace and Clara, pressuring them to send Daniel away. The threats began subtly, a sneer here, an aggressive remark there, but gradually escalated, filling Grace with a quiet fear she tried to hide from Daniel. One day, as he noticed her unease, he pressed her to tell him the truth, and her hesitant confession filled him with rage. Daniel confronted his father with a fury he had never felt before. He warned him to stop the threats, to leave Grace and Clara in peace. His father, dismissive, mocked his son's dedication to these simple villagers. But Daniel stood his ground, vowing that if the harassment continued, he would cut ties with the family forever. In a cruel act of retaliation, Daniel's father went further. His men confronted Clara, pushing her, causing her to fall and injure herself. When Daniel heard, he was devastated. He rushed to the hospital, his heart heavy with guilt and anger, unable to believe that his family would sink to such depths. He sat by Clara's bedside, holding her hand, his face etched with sorrow. In that quiet room, he made a promise to her, swearing that he would protect her and Grace, no matter what. He resolved to sever all ties with his father, knowing that no amount of wealth or power could justify the harm that had been done to the people he loved. As Clara slowly recovered, something remarkable happened. Daniel's father, who had always been so cold and immovable, seemed to soften. For the first time, he seemed to understand that Daniel's love for Grace and Clara was something real, something he couldn't control or diminish. He came to the hospital, humbled, asking to speak with Clara and Grace. Daniel watched as his father, in a rare moment of vulnerability, apologized for the pain he had caused. Clara, ever wise and forgiving, accepted his apology with a grace that touched everyone in the room, even as the wounds of betrayal lingered. With his father's reluctant blessing, Daniel felt a new freedom. He could finally imagine a future with Grace, one unburdened by the chains of his family's expectations. They returned to the village together, hand in hand, their connection deepened by the trials they had endured. Daniel shared his dreams with her, promising to build a life grounded in love, respect, and honesty. Though hesitant at first, Grace gradually opened her heart to him once more, finding joy in his genuine affection and his humility. In the days that followed, Daniel embraced a life that was both simple and profound. He split his time between the village and the city, running his business with a newfound integrity, helping to uplift those in need, and staying close to the community that had taught him so much. Together, Daniel and Grace built a family surrounded by friends, laughter, and the warmth of true love, a love Daniel had once thought impossible. Their story serves as a reminder of the powerful lessons in love, humility, and the courage to seek truth. If this story moved you, let your like be a spark that fuels the magic of storytelling. Your support allows stories like these to find their way into the world, touching hearts and inspiring the power of real love. Hit the like button, subscribe for more magical tales, and let's create a world where love and kindness shine brighter than anything else.